Welcome to FO Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Carle, a retired CIA officer, the author of The Interrogator, and a fantastic geopolitical analyst. In the next hour, the two of us, the Rajput and the Wasp, will make sense of the three most important developments of the month. In fact, we already do so in our podcast, The Dialectic, which you can find on Apple, Google, Spotify, and the rest of the platforms. In short, in the next hour, we will make sense of the world. So there we go. Our three top choices for April are French and Slovenian elections. That's number one. Number two, China's big move in the Indo-Pacific. And number three, the geopolitical implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. Over to you, Glenn.
Okay. Well, make sense of the world. I don't know. At least wrestle with the issues in an honorable effort to make sense. But beyond that, I'll leave it to our listeners in the future, really, to see how prescient or insightful we've been. This month's session for me is particularly stimulating, or I'm excited about. I mean, not that one should be excited about bad things happening, but I think these are unusually meaningful events. Every month, it's somewhat arbitrary to choose, what is truly consequential. Not everything is consequential, but in this month, I think each of them is, and at least two of them, and I think you can make a strong argument, all three of the subjects we'll touch upon interrelate in a real and significant way. So let's start with the order we'll do them doesn't indicate, at least to me, an order of priority or importance, but you have to start someplace.
The same for me. The ordering is something we put together for flow, we put together for just convenience. It's not necessarily the case that if we pick some subject number three, it is number three in priority or importance.
Right. Well, although what's closest to my heart, of course, is always France. And so we'll start with the French and the Slovenian elections. And of course, France it's a major power. I think everyone who pays attention to international affairs or European affairs will know that had Marine Le Pen, a far right, which is a really a limp-wristed euphemism for a fascist. We should call things what they are. She is a fascist. Had a fascist been elected president of France, the ramifications would have been stupendous, historic. It would have been a grievous blow to NATO at a time of European war, threatening world war. It would have been a grievous blow to the European Union, the halting but real effort, historical in a millennial sense, not millennial in a religious way, but as in thousands of years, to unify Europe more substantively or in fact than at any time, I would argue, since the Roman Empire. But she lost. I wasn't surprised. I never really doubted that a pretty clear majority of the French electorate would vote for moderation or the liberal democracy, individual rights, and rather than this blood and soil based view of nationhood and France's destiny. But it is consequential because the far right and the far left, which, political spectrum is not a line. The political spectrum is a circle. So the far right and the far left intersect sort of at the depths. Up being good, down being bad. the far right has prospered over the my adult lifetime, which is what 50 years almost at this point. Certainly, from the first time that I went to France, I think um, I've written about the following anecdote, but the anecdote I think truly is illustrative of what France has done to itself, what has been the foundation of the increasing stresses on liberal democracy and the quote normative world order, individual rights, the sort of Whiggist projection of how history will evolve, the whole rise of the individual with the Renaissance. So when I first went to France in the mid 1970s, I was living in two places. I lived on a farm in central France, but in this particular moment, in the fall of 1976, I was living in Grenoble and attending the university. And I used to walk home late at night. And those of you who know France will realize that other than Paris, French, at least in all the times I've lived in France, perhaps it's different in 2022. I don't think so. Cities other than Paris will largely shut down. They are quiet come nighttime. So I would find myself, and I'm speaking just about literally, the only person on the streets walking through a reasonably large city on my way home, except there were large numbers of lone, mostly individual Arab men. These are Maghrébins. These are men from Algeria and Morocco, a few from Tunisia, but mostly Algeria and Morocco. And they were forlorn, and they were at loose ends, and they were clearly had nowhere to go. They were there because during the boom years after World War II, of France's economic glorious years, they were needed for labor. They worked in the factories and they worked in the farms. But they weren't French, they weren't accepted, and yet they were there. And I wondered at the time, goodness, why? And then I went, just to deepen the point, not long after I was walking again the streets, this time of Paris late at night, and I found myself, I was taken by a friend who was living there to the Saint-Denis quarter, which is a very working class quarter. And I'm not exaggerating, there were large groups of, again, Maghrébin men on the street playing dice against the curb. And I was the only non-Maghrébin, essentially, among hundreds, thousands of men as I walked the street, except for the CRS, the French riot police, who would every so often, from what I could see, randomly grab one of these men and put him into a paddy wagon, as the others in the group that the CRS approached and grabbed the man from would scatter. And I thought, why would a society do this? And you bring people that you don't want and who can't assimilate or don't want to assimilate or are not allowed to assimilate. It just sets itself, the society is setting itself up for attention. Now, historically in the United States, which I think is just illustrative of how societies cope with ethnic diversity, after the Civil War, the northern cities, who were quite pleased with themselves for having been abolitionists on the whole and fought against slavery, initially welcomed free blacks. And so they thought, well, look how successful we are. That was roughly true until the population of a given area reached about 10% minority, at which point there was a pretty clear visceral rejection of these outsiders, people who were not like us, who don't belong, coming to change things around. And the racism that America struggled with is our original sin that we all know about, and that has continued to this day, this struggle. So this is fundamentally why over 40 years the far right in France has risen and why democracies are stressed. There's globalization, technological change, unemployment, all of which ties in also. But I think fundamentally it's a cultural issue. I'm not arguing against immigration. I am a strong proponent of it. I am one of the cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic proponents and so on. But I think the reality is that, and we've seen this, Donald Trump exists because of why Marine Le Pen has been successful, and why you have more than 40% of France now espousing political views that are fundamentally anti-democratic. It's also true that 60% roughly support the election. So why is this significant in the larger sense? Because this is the large issue that is roiling, destabilizing, challenging Western society's liberal democracy, the whole model. In France, in the United States, in England with Brexit, there's the rise of the far right again in Germany. Please, sorry, Atul.
No, not at all. I think, Glenn, whilst I don't disagree with you as to the challenge of creating liberal democracy in states that were historically defined around un roi, une loi, une foi, one king, one law, one faith, because the nation state born in 1648 was a phenomenon that wanted social cohesion, and social cohesion included religious commonality, included ethnic commonality, included linguistic commonality. Germany was an exception in a way, because northern Germany was Protestant and southern Germany was Catholic, but they were united by German language. And remember, Germany only won unification in 1871. They were a couple of centuries late to the party. France and England were the original nation states. And we know that multi-ethnic empires existed. The Roman Empire was multi-ethnic. The Ottoman Empire was multi-ethnic. But creating a multi-ethnic liberal democracy in what was hitherto a nation state is always going to be difficult, and France is a particular example of it. But I want to not posit this just, and here I'll disagree with Glenn, and probably take Peter Isaacson's side a bit, against a vote for democracy and a vote for fascism, or a vote for a far-right extremist. The reality is, and I have encountered this in endless conversations with French friends, particularly younger French friends, is that the Fifth Republic has failed. It was created because the Fourth Republic didn't work out, and the Fourth Republic was ended by Charles de Gaulle, and the Fifth Republic has a presidential system, sort of, but now it has a 5-year term. But then, of course, you can have cohabitation with another party, and in the words of many a legal scholar, many a constitutional scholar, it is neither fish nor fowl. And so there's a structural issue underlying French democracy, in the sense that politicians do not represent the people anymore. People are voting for the least worst option. Now, that's normally the case. But now what is happening is that the disenchantment with the status quo is so high that traditional parties have imploded. They don't exist. Macron ran as an outsider, but he's an insider. He went to l'ENA. He's an NRK. He worked for Rothschilds. And many people think he's a con artist. They call him le président des riches, the president of the rich, which was...
He is a stereotype at least as much as I am. That's certainly true.
Well, that's absolutely true. Or at least as much as I am in the Indian context. I'm a Rajput, so that is true. But he doesn't have the common touch. And his career is very much l'ENA, Rothschilds, whatever. And one could go on, one could belabor the point, but the reality is that the French system, with its over 10% unemployment, with its problem of immigration, with its problem of political parties not representing society anymore, is in a crisis. I think this happens every few decades, in that political systems are created in response to pressures of a particular era or a particular time, and then they trophy what you call, Glenn, the thickening of processes happens. And then when a measure becomes a metric, then things lose meaning. It's like when scores in GMAT become the end game instead of being a signifier of something. When the application process at Harvard becomes gaming the check boxes you have to the boxes you have to tick. That yeah, I saved a spotted hyena in Africa, and I can serve at 100 miles an hour, and I can, I'm Superman and more, or Superwoman and more. And when it becomes more of a game, when the spirit of the law is lost to the letter of the law, then you have a problem.
I did find in my first weeks at Harvard, I played football. This is a long time ago now, almost 50 years ago. And I was very good. I was a very good football player.
You were a better ice hockey player, though.
Well, that's another story. But in any event, the press office for the sports department at Harvard approached my teammates and me and asked us about our exploits that they would put into a press kit. And I said, well, I don't know. This is true. I am not just puffing myself up. I am either naive or innocent or pure or a fool. I don't know. But I said, I don't know. And I came up with whatever I could think about myself. But many of my teammates literally had pre-made press kits that they had used to market themselves. Which I guess makes me a fool. I don't know. I thought, what are you doing? It's just crazy. But in any event, it's all on merit. We all got in purely on merit, Atul. I mean, you're slurring Harvard. You must stop this. I don't want our talk isn't supposed to be be about French. I would agree and disagree, and then I'll try to make a larger point. All of the problems you describe, I think, are real, but in a way, it's plus ça change. This is same old for France. France, perversely, we all have our perversities culturally. Opposes the central state and views it as oppressive and interfering, and looks to the central state to solve the solutions of the central state. And when it can't, it blames the central state at that point. The big difference, I think, with this eternal dynamic of sort of a Hegelian dynamic, even in French society and politics, is the much deeper and broader cultural diversity, which France has, as a modern cosmopolitan state, has to try to cope with in a way it never did before. The same is true for the United States, actually, although we've always claimed to be this multi-ethnic state. It's only since 1965 that the historical narrative has been challenged progressively by the reality of true ethnic diversity and opportunity to the people who are not from my background. I'd like to link it to the Slovenian issue, however. I don't know Slovenian politics well, but I do know that it's a consequential election from a small country. Because only 2 million.
Melania Trump comes from Slovenia.
Yes, well, we all have our skeletons in our closets.
Yeah, and it's the only country with love in its name.
With love in its name.
Yeah, LOVE. That's Slovenia.
I missed that one. I am not a poet. However, the incumbent, this fellow named Janus, lost, and he has built himself up as Europe's little Trump. He admires Trump. And why does he admire Trump? Because for the same reason he admires Viktor Orban from Hungary and Vladimir Putin in Russia, because he's a strong man who won't be constrained by cultural, legal, and ethnic obligations to moderation and tolerance. He's the macho man. He has more testosterone than anyone, and dadgummit, you aren't going to tell me what to do. This is a viscerally appealing thing. This is why people still like Nazi uniforms. It's a deep psychological impulsion almost to be drawn towards alpha pretensions. Happily, a majority of the population in Slovenia has rejected this time and affirmed what happened in France. The adherence to, deep belief in, into moderation, individual rights, and democracy. So it's not a repudiation of the whole movement, but it is a consequential election.
I think there's a difference. In France, a sitting president was re-elected, and here, somebody from the opposition unseated someone with authoritarian tendencies in power. So I think France and Slovenia, I would argue, are different in the sense that in France, I don't know if people have necessarily voted for individual rights. They've voted for the less worse option, and many have held their nose in voting. I know most young people that I have spoken to, that, many of whom write for Fair Observer, do not like Macron one bit, and believe that he's more of a marketing man.
Mhm.
And many of them have talked about maybe it's time to bring back the Third Republic, because yes, you're right, France has had this perennial problem going back a few hundred years. They created the first centralized modern nation state. That meant the destruction of the local powerhouses. And then at the same time, because that central state ossified, they've had periodic revolutions. And they are on to their Fifth Republic, lest we forget. The US, which I believe promulgated its constitution in 1782, is still on its First Republic. So there's a huge difference between the US and the French, particularly when it comes to the nature of the state. The nature of the state in France and the nature of the Republic has proved unstable. The Indian Republic, frankly, is older than the French Republic, which is shocking. Think of it. So I think France is a separate phenomenon. And in France, I would say that, yes, the crisis for France and Europe sort of passed, but it's around the corner. Come parliamentary elections, you could see a completely hung parliament. And Peter Isaacson wrote a brilliant article. He's on the call. He lives in France. He's an American who has turned French. He's as French as they come now. He eats garlic and cheese.
His life is to be totally envied.
Well, anyway, but as he rightly points out, that France
understands tritone harmonies in a way that I do not, I cannot, I won't for years. So this is a man to be admired in all ways.
Exactly. You can see we are both going to be co-chairs of the Peter Isaacson fan club. But importantly, Peter's prediction that the parliamentary elections will cause major changes in the political system, that stands true. So I think when it comes to Slovenia, the change is that, yes, an incumbent far-right government has been pushed out because it may have been right about many of the problems it raised, that government, but when in power, it failed. It failed to provide solutions, and it failed to hold on to its mandate. And in a way, democracy is in debt. It didn't go the Hungary way, which is always the danger in a newly democratic country, which was part of the Soviet bloc. Although Yugoslavia was not exactly Soviet, but it was part of the communist bloc. France is a different kettle of fish. And I think we'll move on to the next topic because it's getting to be 12:24. We want to end it precisely on the hour. A lot of people are very busy. Some people here in the audience are German, and we don't want to offend their sensibilities. So we have to be on time.
Oh my God.
Questions, anyone on this part of the...
May I just say one last thing before please send your questions, but I think the point of the two elections to me is not, as some pundits are positing or musing about, that this is the breaking of the crest of this populist surge. I think that's a silly thing to say. It is not in any way. These are two elections where the liberal democratic aspirations and practices have been affirmed or held off. What is indisputably a long-term, we're talking 2-generation at least, slow rise of rejection of the liberal mission, and this is of concern. So not conclusive elections, but from my perspective at least, happy results for now, and that's, I think, all one could say.
Brilliant. We do have one question from Nilesh Jain, and he says, democracy all over has become picking the lesser evil. Why is the French election result different? I think the French election result is different, Nilesh, because of the peculiar nature of the French political system. Just because the presidential election is over doesn't mean we are all settled. There'll be a parliamentary election, and power is shared between the president and the prime minister. and the president appoints the prime minister, sort of, but the prime minister has to have majority in parliament. And the rival in France was Marine Le Pen, who got over 40% of the vote. Her father first ran against Chirac, and now, of course, she's run a second time in the final round. So it's different because you have a far-right party now challenging someone who created his own party. So two completely new political parties. Imagine as if the Republicans and Democrats disappeared in America. Imagine that. You're in America, Nilesh, you're in New York. Just imagine the BJP and the Congress disappearing in India. And you have one newly forged party that appeared 5 years ago and rode all the way to presidency on the, on the basis of a very good marketing campaign and a charismatic candidate. And the other, a far-right party, which has been around, but now has pushed everyone else to the sidelines. So it is significant because the risk to the French Republic and the French democracy is deep. And of course, it is a reflection of all the tensions Glenn has talked about, immigration, culture, but also from my point of view, economics, the failure of the French Fifth Republic system, which has been there actually for a while. I would argue that it appeared as early as the Mitterrand days, and it, under Chirac, it was problematic, and especially under Sarkozy and Hollande, they were one-term presidents. Things were quite there was a lot of publicity of both of them and their one's bling bling lifestyle and the other's affairs, but they weren't able to make any policy changes. And France has been stuck since 1980 in the over 10% unemployment zone. And France spends a lot on welfare, but its social mobility is less than Canada. There are deep structural issues in
however,
France.
France's social mobility, this is what I'm going to say, is an indictment of the United States more than a praise of France. However, France's social mobility is greater than that of the United States today.
But that's a low bar. France's social mobility has fallen dramatically compared to 1980. Look at what percentage of LENA people come from working class backgrounds. Hardly any.
It's always been virtually, it's 1 out of 20, and that's only because of efforts by the institutions to make somebody come. I just had to say one thing, and then we'll move on. I think the question, democracy all over or the comment, which is intended to inspire observations. Democracy all over has become picking the lesser evil. Why is the French election result different? I would say the forming of the question is the issue that you should think about. And it is both more hopeful, idealistic, and destructive conceptually than than the way I see reality. That's the case of democracy. Democracy is never this Platonic ideal of right-thinking men coming to an agreement, and then everything goes towards the broad sunlit uplands. It is always a clash of interests, and to succeed, a series of compromises. Therefore, a series of disappointments, of imperfections from everyone's perspective. But the alternative is what Marine Le Pen or Donald Trump or other autocrats would advocate, which is to impose a given view, or Xi Jinping, a given view, which will then perhaps be more efficient and perhaps be correct, but is also more likely to be one person's view and to alienate and anger and dissatisfy a larger number still. So this is the dilemma of democracy.
To that point, we have a podcast on democracy itself, which you can go and listen to it. And we talk about the fundamental challenge of democracy, because democracy can disintegrate into interests and identity groups. And the use of the word Platonic ideal is ironic, perhaps unconsciously, because Plato was disillusioned with democracy. He saw the disintegration of Athenian democracy. And the Platonic ideal, frankly, is the first blueprint for communism, because what is he
I would say
positing?
Plato was the father of totalitarianism, right? He's no friend of Plato, really, actually.
Well, he was a clever chap. I think we can discuss Plato another time.
He was a mouthpiece for the ruling elite of Athens, and therefore should be opposed by true Democrats. But that's another subject.
Anyway, Peter comments, the party system has failed, but it is still maintained as the foundation of democracy in the US and in France, and actually in the UK, Peter. And Le Pen would have been unable to govern even if she had got elected. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't really matter what she stood for. So I don't know if I'll go all along that, but the point is that part of the reason the French elections, Nilesh, are important, part of the reason American elections are important is because modern democracy looks to France and the US in some ways because of the two great revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, as exemplars. And they have an outsized impact, not just on the European world, but the rest of the world itself. So moving on to the second issue.
Yes, I would like to take us to August 9, 378 AD. In what is now Macedonia, as perhaps a history, an example that we are living in late April 2022 in the South Pacific, in the Solomon Islands, and what Atul has framed as China's big move in Indo-Pacific, and I will. I think I will differ with the big move, but by China, but only in how I describe the events. Shall I stop and you discuss this, or should I carry on?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So this is the second issue, and it's one that I have found particularly interesting because for most people not in Polynesia, or perhaps in the Southwest Pacific or Asia, who would ever think about the Solomon Islands?
Well, we've got a colleague, T. Nguyen, who is Vietnamese and whose whole historical work has been on that part of the world. So we've got someone who thinks, writes, and
a
works
broader
on
mind and with more insight than clearly this person on the east coast of the Atlantic Ocean, of the United States and the Atlantic Ocean. So what has happened, and why do I mention Adrianople? And I'm not going to take us for long back into the ancient Rome, as much as I love to inhabit there. In 378 AD, the Romans were trying to hold off the barbarians, the hordes, outside the borders of the empire. At this place in Adrianople was where the immigrants would routinely, that's where they passed. But they were stopped. They were ordered, the emperor ordered the army to keep them out until they couldn't any longer. And the only solution was to let them in because of the pressure of even further eastern hordes, forcing people to become refugees and migrants. And so they opened the gates. They couldn't do otherwise anyway. And many say this was the end of beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. That's actually a very simplistic view, because what had happened to Rome, I would argue, and many others do, I'm hardly the original thinker in this, is a multi-generational slow shift in the cultural and ethnic and then political and power distributions of what was Rome, as the borders were no longer hard, and the nature of what it was to be Roman evolved and morphed into something different. But that was the critical point, that date. Now, why is that? To amuse myself, I compare this to the Solomons, because what's happened? In the Solomon Islands, which are about 2,000 kilometers north of the northern Australian coast, China and the government of the Solomon Islands have signed a security pact, security agreement, which for the first time will allow the Chinese military potentially to establish, have ship visits, to send personnel, to establish a base. Now, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands says, this will not happen. But that's also what was said about the atolls in the South China Sea that China has occupied and then built artificial islands on. They said, we have no intention whatsoever of militarizing them. And of course, they immediately became literally airfields and naval bases with ships that are naval ships disguised. Why is this of any significance? It's the first time since 1945 that there has been a challenge to what has been U.S. hegemony, naval superiority. Over 90% of the Solomon Island population, according to various polls, vehemently opposes the agreement. There are questions as to whether, I mean, literally, it was only the Prime Minister who did this in secret, even from his own cabinet. But part of the agreement also, in a shocking throwback to the colonial era, which Atul will know about with the English and what imperial powers have done everywhere, it gives extraterritoriality to Chinese citizens. Any Chinese person, military or civilian, who will work in the Solomon Islands will not be subject to Solomon's law. They will be tried under Chinese law. In 2018, but this is not the breaking point. This rather is I would argue, instead of a big move, it's sort of the drop that overflows the cup of change. China for 15 years has been actively working to, one, push the US military away from its coast. That has de facto occurred now. In a crisis, US aircraft carriers will not operate within 1,000 miles of the Chinese coast because it's too dangerous to. And the Chinese Navy is now too competent and too large to take that risk unless there were a major war. In 2013, China replaced Australia as the Solomon Islands' largest trading partner. That has happened in most of the states in Micronesia over the past decade, as has happened in many, many places in the world. In 2018, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched their recognition from Taiwan to China. And now there were riots there, which in the Solomons in protest about that, because the majority of the population doesn't want that to happen. The Australian Army was called in to establish order. And now in 2022, you have this agreement which caught everybody by surprise because the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands did it essentially unilaterally with the foreign ministry in Beijing. So this all signals not a single big move, but if not the culmination, but a breakthrough, certainly, by China's strategic policy of projecting its power, naturally, as it rises in power, challenging US hegemony, and creating a potential strategic dilemma for its opponent, which is the US, Australian, Japanese, New Zealand imperial coalition of white guys, plus Japanese. So it is a very consequential, a consequential geostrategic event. In response, Australia, Canberra, Wellington, Washington all said, oh my goodness, this can't be, this is no good. The White House dispatched its most senior Pacific National Security Council representative to Honiara on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons to say, oh, let's make nice and we'll give you all sorts of stuff. But this is sort of a day short and a dollar late, a dollar short and a day late. And there has been a substantial qualitative change in the order of things in the South Pacific, which reflects, of course, the rise of China and the relative loss of power, of hegemony of the United States. It's a big deal.
It's a huge deal for Australia, not just the US, because now they are operating in Australia's backwater. And Australia just signed the AUKUS deal, which caused the French to lose their marbles a bit. And Australia has signaled very clearly that it is firmly in the Anglosphere. It's it's willing to take on the Chinese in naval terms, and in the security realm. And in a way, this cat and mouse game has been going on for a while in the Pacific. Obama, of course, tried the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was basically a judoka's way of controlling China or pinning down China. Of course, Donald Trump through the kitchen sink and unleashed trade war, and that was more of a to use a pun, more a bull in the China shop approach to China. And then, of course, Biden has signaled that the hardening that happened under Donald Trump is here to stay, and China is certainly an adversary. Now, of course, now the Asia pivot that Obama talked about might have ended. Now Europe is again a fixation, and with a war in Ukraine, with America signaling, as the Secretary of Defense said, you know, the aim now is a weakened Russia so that it cannot have any more misadventures in its near abroad. And China seized its moment, because what is the US going to do? Is the US going to suddenly give the Solomon Islands a very sweet deal, give it a great trade deal, and send in a whole bunch of investment? Or will the US send its Navy? Will the Aussies do anything? So what the Chinese are doing is sending a signal that, yeah, you've been playing in our backyard, now we'll start playing in yours. And so it's the Australians who are worried, the New Zealanders who are worried, the Indians are very worried, because after all, remember, it's called the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean. India is the only country which with an ocean named after it. And the Indians have been worried about being surrounded by a string of pearls, lots of Chinese bases. There's one in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is broke, by the way, right now.
And
Singapore
and Pakistan.
And Singapore is worried, and other Southeast Asian states are worried. Vietnam is worried because Vietnam has had a war. The last war China had was with Vietnam. I believe it was in 1979, if I'm not mistaken. So this move has certainly set a cat amongst the pigeons. We have a comment here before we move on to the next. Peter, as ever, it says, hasn't the US position in Ukraine accelerated the trend of pushing away from US hegemony, except, of course, in Europe? But even that is ambiguous, and we can only see the emerged part of the iceberg. Well, Peter, you may have a point. There has been talk of a petro-yuan trade. If that happens, that would be terribly counterproductive to US interests. There has been talk of a rupee-ruble exchange that would not be extremely beneficial to the US as well. So the this brings us very, very neatly on to our third point, which we were going to talk about, which is the geopolitical implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. I've foreshadowed some things. You know, there are three questions. How is the war progressing? What is the change in US objectives? Why is this a strategic calamity for Russia? And then I could add a fourth. I could riff off and say what might be the economic implications. We've covered that earlier, but we could delve into that and the geopolitical broader implications of this war later if we have time. But I'll let Glenn address these three questions, and I will chime in very briefly on each of them.
Sure. Just to quote, conclude on the Sullivan's issue, because I really do think it's significant. I guess 3 points. First, you said, well, gee, what will the response be by the US and Canberra and Wellington and so on? Will they pour more money? And the answer is yes. The visit by, gosh, I used to work with him, I forget his first name now, Campbell, who's the Asian, the officer in National Security Council responsible for Asia, Chuck Campbell, just went to the Solomons to say, "Oh, gosh, you guys should have consulted, and this is, we're your big friends, and this and that." He's also bringing pledges of money and an embassy again and so on. But the telling sign is the U.S. has not had an embassy in the Solomons for 40 years. Now they're going to put it back, a day late and a dollar short. Canberra, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head. The Australians have a Pacific Initiative, which really means a sustained program of investment in the South Pacific and Micronesia to maintain influence, of course. New Zealand has a Pacific Initiative with a slightly different name. Exact same objectives. The United States has a Pacific Initiative to do the same thing. Japan has its initiative, which is actually targeting Africa more than the South Pacific, but also the South Pacific. All of them trying to maintain their supremacy of influence over that of China. But will it be enough? We'll see. The fact remains that the largest trading partners of the Solomons, of Kiribati, and the most Micronesian states is China. And so my final point is that why are the Solomons of importance and what's going on? There are two things to consider. Geography is destiny, and money is destiny. Geography, in the Solomons case, because it exists at a critical place along sea lanes that allow communication of trade, but also the militaries, thus of power, among in the south, New Zealand and Australia, and to the north and east, Japan and the United States. And he who sits there can muddy the waters. And then money is destiny because, yes, these initiatives by the states I just mentioned are nice, but the largest trading partner is and probably will remain China. And so money buys influence. And that's what's going on. It's a shift, historic shift in the balance of power in the East. Now, the Putin's war in Ukraine. How's the war progressing? I'm not a military expert, but clearly not the way that Putin would like, had initially aimed at. However, he does seem to have focused on a probably more reasonable and achievable objective, which is to consolidate and expand control of the eastern portions, which are majority Russian speaking, of the Donbass and Luhansk areas. Those are the border areas with Ukraine with Russia, and the Crimea, extending north from the Crimean Peninsula, and then, if he can, controlling all of the coast, which would sort of castrate Ukraine and make geographically coherent and much stronger, easier to defend and easier to conquer, or at least more possible to conquer, this Russia adjacent parts of Ukraine. Can he succeed? That remains to be seen, and it would seem possibly not. And one final objective, which one hears about and seems quite coherent, is the Transnistria area, which is the eastern portion controlled by Russia, with Russian soldiers in it now, of Moldova, which is to the west of Ukraine and south and west of Odessa along the Adriatic, the Black Sea coast. So those seem to be the objectives, but it does not seem to be progressing well. The Russians are performing better militarily, but than they did earlier, but are still suffering severe losses. And the Ukrainian army, from what we hear, is far better armed now and remains quite coherent and capable. So I'm not an optimist from the Russian perspective of military success, which is really alarming. Not that I want them to succeed, but absent any success that Putin can claim, I see no end to the horrors. What's the change in U.S. objectives? Now here, Atul and I jumped out of our chairs, respectively, 2 days ago when we heard, I was talking to my wife about this, we were just gobsmacked that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin of the United States, said, oh, the US objective now is to so degrade Russia militarily that it can never project its power and do this to any nation again. But I would like that personally, but that is a phenomenal, shocking escalation of US war aims. And I would argue not a wise thing to say in public.
I would say it's a stupid thing to say. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Talk softly but carry a big stick."
Yes.
And here he is a modern day Secretary of Defense in Kyiv saying that, oh, we are going to castrate Russia. Now, even if you're a Russian dissident and you detest Putin, you would think, hang on a minute. Does this mean I will live in a country which is rendered impotent by American might? And remember, the Russians, and we wrote about this. We wrote about this in our December 2021 article. The Russians have not forgotten the 1990s. For them, the arch-villain Jeffrey Sachs collaborated with people like Glenn, evil CIA conniving types, and ensured that Russia was not just on its back, not just on its knees, but on its back. And it was during that period of weakness that America then expanded NATO right at their doorstep. America then pushed and pushed and pushed. And this plays into the Russian paranoia. This plays into the Russian narrative of us, the great victim, and American, the great Satan. This plays into not just Putin, but it plays into the 1917 Russian Revolution when Americans intervened. And of course, so did many of the countries of Europe, UK, France, etc., in favor of the Tsar. So this is dangerous territory.
It's a fundamental mistake of diplomacy, not necessarily of objective. But the Chinese have forgotten this lesson too, which the Chinese were the first ones to teach over 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is you never so box in your opponent that he has no option but to oppose. Honor, Thucydides, what motivates men, what motivates states? Fear, honor, and interest. And honor is people die for their sense of personal integrity and independence and agency, at least the belief that one has it, or at least the attempt to have it. So to state so baldly a policy that gives your opponent no option but to oppose you or to be cowed, and no one is ever cowed, people are destroyed or become obsequious and stiletto you in the back, but never are cowed, is a big mistake. Now, the objective, that's debatable, is whether it's achievable or wise. I wouldn't oppose seeking to do that, but they shouldn't have said so. So that's a very consequential, historically consequential change in US objectives and in the meaning of what's going on in Ukraine, because Ukraine has always been primary for the Ukrainians, but secondary for the larger issues that are at play, tragic as that is for the poor Ukrainians who are the victims. Just like the Solomon Islanders, geography is destiny, and the tank-friendly Central European steppes are where empires have clashed for millennia and will continue to do so. The Eastern Empire, the Western Empire, however they are constituted at the moment. So this is a major, major issue, just like the Solomons are destined to be the pawn in this great game between China and the United States. So why is the war, however, a strategic calamity for Russia, however this plays out? Even if it were to end today with, quote, success for Russia in Ukraine, because lastingly, the game has changed and Russia is being isolated. Now, there's China, and there are many, quote, neutral or non-aligned states that will continue to do business with with Russia, but that will not change the fact that investment in research and development, the size of the budget, the military the potential for military power of Russia will be lastingly changed. And NATO, Western Europe, the European Union, US-Europe relations, all of which were somnolent at most, have been revivified. That's not good for Russia. So there's almost nothing good to come out of this. Let's say Russia succeeds and it has the Russian-speaking portions of Ukraine. In this larger strategic sense, so what? Because Putin has become the finest diplomat NATO has ever had, and he is now largely extending the strength of the area of operations in the focus of NATO in a way which he explicitly has sought to oppose and undermine through his invasion. And he said he had no choice. In a way, he's right, because he cannot stop the westernization of Ukraine unless he turns eastern Donbass into North Korea, which he may well do. But it's strategically a loss. And finally, on Peter's point, yes, the focus on the large tectonic issue of our era, which is the rise of China, will be to some extent modulated, tempered, I suppose, by necessity, because resources are not infinite, by the current Russian issue in Europe. I don't think strategically it will. I think we'll find three poles coming, and then I will stop, Atul. I'm sorry, I won't try not to go on too long. The normative ideal or Western imperium, however you wish to characterize it, the two things being identical, has been strengthened or will find a reality and a mission again as a result of this. But we'll also have a return in some ways to the Cold War with a reduced imperium from Russia, whose number of allies are more restricted, but that simply seeks a realpolitik balance of power, sphere of influence order, which is open to autocrats by claiming to respect the sovereignty of states domestically. And then you have the third quote order or pole of China, India, who are the two really consequential states, and several dozen of what were non-aligned or were neutral or were third world states that seek to benefit from the normative economic system of the West to the post-World War II economic order, while frankly rejecting or refusing to accept all of the obligations of it. Which, so long as they can get away with it, is in their interest to do. But long term, I think they would not find themselves happy were the Russian and Chinese models of interstate relations to come and play upon them, as India finds along its northern border. So that's how the world has broken down now, with the one difference from 1945 to 1989 or 2016, in that India and China are global powers that can simply say, no, we don't agree with you, the United States, and do what they wish. And they're peer competitors in a way that the United States has never had, at least peer competitors. And then you have regional powers that can almost do the same thing in their areas, Turkey, Brazil, Iran. And so it is a more chaotic world, and the lack of equilibrium is disequilibrium, which is a challenge, if not a danger.
And that is very well said. And I would agree that we will see more chaos, more disequilibrium, what the Pentagon has termed VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. We will have VUCA world. We have a workshop on it, actually, Peter. And I designed it, and of course Glenn took a look at it. What is happening is very interesting. Yes, Russia has faced a strategic calamity, but the US has also suffered enormously because inflation has come home to the US, and the US is now preoccupied in Ukraine, and this has allowed China an opening in South China, in Solomon Islands, and Nilesh said trade is not that important. Nilesh, it's not so much that the trade linked to various currencies is important as much as the pricing of the oil in dollar terms and the possibility of such trade taking place. Because if dollar weakens as a medium of exchange, that is not good for US interests. Remember, the pound used to be the medium of exchange, and all these little things are chipping away of that global system, with the post-war system. And Peter pointed out that NATO and the French Fifth Republic are in the same state, maybe, but I think institutions around the world created around the end of World War II, 1945, whether it is the United Nations, whether it is the International Monetary Fund, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is various political systems, they are facing questions as to relevance because they have atrophied, they probably have their coronary arteries full of cholesterol, and perhaps this is just the human condition that every few decades systems give, and you have conflict and friction, and you come up with something that is more responsive, and perhaps we are going through that trend. And on that note, final questions, and then we'll call it a day for this month. Any final questions, comments from any of you? All right, we've bored everyone on a Wednesday afternoon when the sun is out in Washington D.C. and the sun is setting further east, and it's still in the ascendant further west. On that very cheery note, I bid you adieu from Glenn and me. Have a great rest of the month, and we'll see you in May.
The most consequential month since we've started to do these talks.
All right. See you anon.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.